Hello and welcome to Money Talks COVID-19 Daily Bulletin for Wednesday, April 8th. My name is Anthony Okolia. In a few moments, Kim Parley will be speaking with Ian Bremmer. He's a president of Eurasia Group and G0 Media on what life could look like when we come out the other side of the coronavirus crisis. But first, a quick wrap of today's market news. Vermont Senator Bernie Sanders is ending his 2020 campaign, clearing the path for Joe Biden to the Democratic nomination. Meanwhile, Air Canada plans to rehire thousands of workers laid off because of COVID-19. The airline is taking advantage of the federal government's wage subsidy program. More than 16,000 workers will be put back on the payroll until at least June 6th. Alberta Premier Jason Kenney is warning the province could be facing its biggest economic challenge since the Great Depression. Kenney says unemployment could be more than 25%. The province also said COVID-19 infections could be as high as 800,000, with more than 3,000 deaths by the end of summer. Meanwhile, officials in China have ended the lockdown of Wuhan, considered the original epicenter of the coronavirus. But some restrictions in the city will remain in place. The city's borders were closed for 76 days. And with people staying indoors, Zoom conference calls have surged in popularity, while the company is being sued over alleged security flaws and privacy concerns. Some users have been hit by so-called Zoom bombs. That's when uninvited users hijack conference calls. And that's a wrap of today's news. Next, Kim Parley and Ian Bremmer on what a post-COVID-19 world looks like.
Ian, everyone keeps talking about when things get back to a new normal. Can you please let us know what you think the new normal is going to look like?
Two new normals. First, when we actually just emerge from lockdown, it's going to feel very different. There's going to be still massive social distancing. People aren't going to feel comfortable going out to crowded restaurants or getting on planes to go to Disneyland or any of the kind of economies of choice that require social interaction. That's going to be very, very different. Supply chain is going to take a while to get back up to speed, and emerging markets, developing countries, where they're not able to do the level of testing and they aren't able to do the kind of lockdowns or social distancing, will be much longer to get up to speed, and there'll still be all sorts of travel restrictions. So I think this is not a V-shaped recovery. This is much more like a U with the eventual pull-up over the next, let's say, 6 months, year. Now, the eventual new normal is when we have a vaccine. It's when people feel comfortable that regular activities are going to be fine again. And I think in that environment, there'll be a few things that'll be new about it. Number one, China's going to have a lot more influence than it did before. Their soft power, quite significant. Their ability to get countries to align with them when the Americans are doing less leadership. Globalization will be more unwound. We'll have less just-in-time supply chain, more just-in-case. That means localization, more nationalization of companies that did badly and of labor forces to ensure that people have something to do in your country. And tech companies are going to be incredibly more powerful. They'll be so important in terms of telemedicine, so important in terms of getting up to speed in tracking who does, who doesn't have the virus, who used to have it, who's immune now. That means giving them your data. It means less privacy. They're more strategic. They're more powerful. While brick and mortar companies, a lot of them are going to go away. So the new normal is going to be very, very different indeed for the global economy.
Let me ask you, I want to dig on a couple of those things. You talked about the supply chain and this idea of, sovereign self-reliance. We're seeing that bubble up right now. What could that look like for countries like the States, like Canada, where everything is so intertwined right now? How do you get to that sovereign self-reliance? It sounds painful.
Yeah, it is going to be painful. But at the same time, having everything built in China is painful too. And there are a lot of CEOs that I've been talking to over the last 3 years who have been saying, look, it used to be really cheap to have labor in China, but that labor's gotten more expensive. The competitive environment on the ground has gotten more challenging. Their companies are stronger, but there's still no rule of law. There's no independent judiciary. And by the way, you don't need as much labor to get the same results today that you did before because of big data and automation. But companies haven't wanted to make those decisions, in part because CEOs don't last very long, on balance less than 5 years. And if it's not urgent, it's not imminent, they're making a lot of money, then why rock the boat? But now, suddenly, it is urgent. It is imminent. We've got this massive disruption, all of this unemployment, and clearly they're going to be forced to make tough decisions. I think those CEOs are going to look to run much more lean, much more efficient, much less commercial real estate, but also much smaller labor footprint. And so even though it's going to be challenging, it's going to be less challenging because they're forced to do it in part for efficiency reasons than it would have been 5 or 10 years ago.
What about the tech side? To dig in on that one a bit. I mean, you've got a number of the tech giants. I mean, the logistics that have been put in place for like the Amazons of the world. You know, they've done so much and they're proving their worth right now. How do you see that changing? I mean, you've got a lot of tech companies based in the States, which you've talked about it. You've got some pretty big players based in China. How does that play out?
Well, they're not global. And this was happening before coronavirus. I mean, Google and Amazon had no basic exposure to China because the Chinese didn't want them there. They wanted their own national champions. Meanwhile, companies like Huawei and ZTE were being cut off by the Americans. And we were telling the Canadians as well, don't you dare work with these guys, right? So I think that was already in place. And on the back of this crisis, there's no question that the Americans are going to be strong about this issue. And other countries, American allies like the Europeans and the Canadians who don't have big tech companies are going to end up more reliant on the Americans.
I've only got about a minute and a half left, but what are some good things that are going to come out of this? I mean, one thing I know people have been pushing for universal basic income and getting those going. I mean, those are happening. They may not be called that, but that is effectively what is happening.
I certainly think that a call for redistribution, when you are hollowing out working and middle classes, when inequality is only growing, is going to get larger going forward. And there will be a number of politicians, mostly progressive, but not only progressive, that will say, we have to find a way to get our healthcare system more resilient, more resistant. One thing I will also say, we've known about pandemics as a problem for a long time, but the only countries that responded really well were the Singapores, the Taiwans, the Hong Kongs, the South Koreas. You know why? Because they had the experience with MERS and SARS. We in the United States, you in Canada didn't. I promise you, we will fight that war in the future. So in other words, you'll see governments putting money in place and resilience in place to make sure that next time around we've got a massive pandemic, we're much better prepared than we were this time.
Ian, thanks very much.
My pleasure.